we begin the day with climate talks in overtime and in trouble. After 2 weeks of talks, tonight the International Climate Conference in Dubai looks headed for failure, thanks to a seemingly unbridgeable divide over the future of fossil fuels. Now, the conference was supposed to be over by now. Instead, negotiators are still trying to agree on the wording of the final paper that everyone signs. A first draft released on Monday was rejected by some countries because it omitted any reference to a phase-out of coal, oil, and gas, which scientists say are the largest contributors by far to global warming. Critics slammed the draft text, calling it a gift to lobbyists for big oil and gas. Climate activists and former U.S. Vice President Al Gore posted this on X, or what used to be known as Twitter. The world desperately needs to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as possible, but this obsequious draft reads as if OPEC dictated it word for word. It is even worse than many had feared. OPEC, of course, being the powerful cartel of oil-producing nations led by Saudi Arabia. Now, they've objected to any strong action against their trillion-dollar industry. Some reports suggesting the Saudis push to drop any mention of fossil fuels altogether. The UAE is hosting this conference and has tried to put a positive spin on everything. Take a listen.
We are trying to agree a comprehensive plan to close the gaps between where the world is and where it needs to be to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. That is our North Star. That has been our North Star all along. Part of this is to include language on fossil fuels in the text. If we can, that would be historic.
Well, outside one of the venues in Dubai, activists kept up the pressure on the negotiators inside, demanding an end to fossil fuels. A range of other measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions may be included in the final text, but these protesters, along with more than 100 countries, are saying now is the time to talk about ending the era of black gold known as oil. Well, my first guest is a climate change and human rights lawyer. Tessa Khan is the founder and executive director of Uplift, an organization pushing to end the dependency on fossil fuels. Ms. Khan, it's good to have you with us tonight. You've been following events in Dubai, I'm sure. I'd like to get your thoughts on what is happening at the conference, particularly this outrage over the wording of this final text.
Yeah, I mean, in short, I think the negotiations are at an impasse in that there is a clear recognition from the majority of countries in the room that, as the science says, you cannot address climate change without addressing fossil fuels. The burning of fossil fuels is what drives the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is not a world in which we stay within that critical threshold of 1.5 degrees that governments have agreed to without phasing out fossil fuels. But of course, there are a handful of big oil and gas producing countries, as well as, I think it's important to say, a number of developing countries who don't think they should be made to phase out fossil fuels without supportive assistance, financial assistance from countries that have industrialized off the back of fossil fuels. So, it's a very difficult point in the negotiations, and it's hard to see how the COP presidency can bridge that.
The man in charge of this conference told reporters yesterday that the draft text was a useful tool to determine the red lines for every country. I heard him say that, and then I thought, well, this is COP 28. I mean, we're not at COP 1 or 2. Aren't we supposed to be beyond identifying red lines? What do you say?
I agree with you. I mean, especially, what we've been hearing, in terms of what's required to meet the climate goals that countries have agreed to, in Paris, the historic Paris Agreement, where everyone committed to staying within 1.5 degrees. Just this year, we've heard again and again from the UN's own agencies, from the International Energy Agency, that in a world where we stay within 1.5 degrees, we can't have more fossil fuels. So I agree that the red lines have been clear and that it is incredibly disappointing to get to this point in the negotiations and not have a solution.
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit here. So the text called for the reduction of fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner to achieve net zero by 2050. Even the mention of fossil fuels is historic, some would say. Would you grant that.
Yeah, I think, it is true that fossil fuels as a whole haven't been mentioned in a text before. We've had a mention of coal in the last couple of years. So that is progress, but it is still extraordinary when, as I said, we know that climate change is driven by burning of fossil fuels, that we are celebrating the mere recognition of that fact in that text without a commitment to phase them out on a timeline that is commensurate with what the science requires, and that indeed recognises that some countries will need support to ensure that they aren't left in serious economic trouble if that transition happens too quickly. I mean, again, none of this is new. So I think we're entitled to expect more from these processes.
And some have said that this outcome was inevitable with a major oil producer like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, hosting the conference.
Yeah, I understand that cynicism. I mean, it's true that there have been other countries that have major fossil fuel industries that have hosted COPs before, and we've had outcomes. But the fact, I think, that the president of this COP is still occupying a position as CEO of a national oil company does raise some real questions over the integrity of the process. And I think the fact that despite, as I said, the majority of countries wanting a fossil fuel phase out, the fact that that language didn't appear in the last draft does start to raise some real questions.
And predictably, there's been major opposition from OPEC nations led by Saudi Arabia. How do you get those nations on board if a fossil fuel phase out is so key to mitigating climate change?
Well, honestly, I think the one good bit of news in 2023 is that the economics of the phase out of fossil fuels are increasingly strong. So the profitability, the fact that there is a massive economic imperative to shift away from fossil fuels towards renewable forms of energy, there is demand for those, the technology exists, it is possible to scale those up. I think if oil and gas companies and oil and gas producing countries were serious about their long-term economic future, they would be pivoting their business models away from oil and gas and towards renewable energy and the low zero carbon technologies of the future. Because as I said, we are in that transition now, and the imperatives exist beyond climate change to move away from fossil fuels.
And isn't that what, for example, Saudi Arabia has this project 2030? Isn't that what you're talking about? A country built on petrodollars that is trying to basically change the DNA of its economy?
It's the right idea, but the fact is that, as the International Energy Agency said just a few months ago, the oil and gas industry is still only responsible for 1% of the investment in renewables globally. It is an industry that is still overwhelmingly committed to extracting and burning fossil fuels. So yes, there are some signs of recognition that the future lies in those alternative forms of energy, but the big oil and gas producers, and I should say, in the UK where I am, the UK government has just approved a major new oil and gas field as well. So it's not just the Gulf states who are, I think, doing absolutely the wrong thing here.
So let's assume then that the flames will continue burning in the fossil fuel industry for some time to come. There's talk about carbon capture as a solution. What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem is simply that it is not scalable commercially in any way that makes it a technology that allows us to continue with business as usual. So there is a tiny amount of carbon capture and storage that is functional at the moment globally, and it would only capture a tiny fraction of the emissions that we're currently creating. And if you look at plans where we continue to burn fossil fuels and indeed increase expansion of fossil fuel production, that relies on quantities of carbon capture and storage that, we've heard experts, again, like the International Energy Agency's chair, say are simply fantasy. It's not affordable, it doesn't exist at scale, and it is a huge risk for us to rely on those technologies materializing in the future at the scale that we need them. And
what about the economic opportunities for the global south to leapfrog from where they are right now in terms of generating energy and just bypass fossil fuels, dirty fuels, and go to sustainable fuels? I'm thinking about Africa, for example. Not everyone has to be Nigeria with with its oil. The Sahara Desert, there's enough surface area there if you wanted to put solar panels there to power the entire continent. Where is the economic imperative to make that a reality?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Africa has hands down some of the best solar resources in the world. And, let's be clear that bypassing fossil fuel development isn't just what's needed to preserve a safe climate, and continents like Africa are some of the most vulnerable to climate change in the world. You would also have all of these other benefits, including reducing air pollution, which takes a massive toll, especially in developing countries when coal and so on are burned. So I think it's absolutely right that we should expect that those countries embrace those opportunities. They absolutely do, though, need financial support and technological support from countries, industrialized countries, who have been promising to provide support for those countries to transition for many years now. And I think that that's at the moment the missing ingredient, as well as private investment from the private sector to ensure that they can leapfrog dirty technologies and move straight to the clean technologies of the future.
Tessa Khan, excellent talking with you. Straight talk and straight analysis about a situation, a problem that deserves everyone's attention. Thank you.